Okay, so art and power, right? Two words that, at first glance, you wouldn't necessarily think go together. Art, we think of beauty, contemplation, maybe something quiet. Power, that's all about influence, control, action.
It's interesting, isn't it, how we instinctively separate those two concepts?
Yeah, but what if, and this is what we're diving into today, what if art and power are way more interconnected than we initially think?
That's the core question we're exploring, and you've brought some really fascinating sources to the table. We're talking everything from, like, the historical use of art by royalty to contemporary legal theories, even activist movements.
Right, like the range of stuff you sent over it's huge. And what's been really surprising is seeing how those seemingly disparate areas actually all connect back to this central idea.
Yeah.
Art's power to shape our identities and even the dynamics of power itself.
And by the end of this, hopefully listeners will walk away with a new lens, a way to look at the art and images they encounter every day with this deeper awareness of the power dynamics at play.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. This guest essay you sent, Art and Power, really got me thinking about, well, the power of art to influence. Right off the bat, the author points out that contrast we talked about. Art being perceived as passive, serene, while power is active, forceful.
Yeah, it's like, think about the images those words conjure up. Power may be a thundering waterfall, a political leader giving this impassioned speech, those very outward displays of force. And then art, it's often seen as this more internal, individual thing, maybe standing in a museum, lost in thought, contemplating a sculpture or a painting.
Right, right. But then the essay turns this idea on its head, makes the case that throughout history, both words and images have consistently moved people to action, stirred emotions, and, yeah, really shaped the course of events.
And the essay then walks us through a bunch of really compelling historical examples, starting with, well, let's go way back, the role of art within the church in Europe. The power of the cross, as the essay calls it.
Which, makes sense. For centuries, artists were primarily in the employ of the church.
And it wasn't just to beautify the church, right? Take early Italian art, for instance. It was almost exclusively religious in subject matter, and it served these vital functions. We're talking like massive altarpieces, large-scale canvases. These weren't just decorations. They were almost like visual tools for conveying the lessons and parables of the Bible.
Oh, that's a good point, because back then, a lot of people couldn't read, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So these artworks made those stories accessible to a much wider audience and, more importantly, made those stories more impactful. It's like art created this visual language of religious authority.
It's like those incredible stained glass windows you see in cathedrals. The essay talks about how the sheer beauty and the storytelling within them, it wasn't just about being aesthetically pleasing, it was really about awe, about making people feel the presence of the divine and reinforcing their faith.
Right. And one example they mentioned is Leonardo da Vinci's Annunciation.
Oh, yeah, beautiful piece.
It brought those biblical figures to life in a way that people could really connect with. And that's the key takeaway here, I think. It wasn't just about doctrine. Art played this huge role in solidifying the church's power, in shaping people's beliefs and experiences, creating that emotional connection to the faith.
So from the power of the church, the essay then moves on to the power of the crown, art and royalty. And again, it wasn't just a matter of personal taste. Rulers deliberately used art to project power, to kind of, cement their legacies.
Absolutely. Think of it this way. By commissioning these grand, impressive artworks, scenes from their kingdoms, biblical stories, even those grand mythological scenes, they weren't just decorating their palaces, they were crafting this image of themselves as powerful, important figures, often with this almost like divine right to rule.
Right. It's like those neoclassical paintings, the ones that depict coronations or those huge battle scenes. They're basically portraying these monarchs with this almost godlike stature.
Exactly. And one example the essay points to is Marie de Medici. Apparently, she wasn't historically that significant a figure in French history, but after her return from exile, she commissioned this incredible series of 24 murals by Peter Paul Rubens' The Medici Cycle, which you can still see today at the Louvre.
That's an impressive way to make your mark, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So Rubens, despite her relatively minor historical impact, he creates this powerful allegorical series that really elevates her to almost legendary status. And it's interesting to think about how art can literally rewrite history in that way, right? Elevate individuals beyond their actual political significance.
Oh, totally. And speaking of rewriting history, we can't forget Napoleon and his massive art collection,
Yeah.
a lot of it acquired through conquest, which eventually formed the basis of the Louvre itself.
Yeah, that's a pretty clear example of the link between political power and cultural capital.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Okay, next up, this one really resonates the power of patriotism. How paintings can be used to tap into those feelings of national identity and even stir up patriotic sentiment.
Totally.
Hmm.
And it's a powerful unifying force, right?
Mm-hmm.
Take Washington crossing the Delaware. You
Mm-hmm.
can't really stand in front of that massive canvas at the Met and not feel that sense of, Washington as this courageous leader embodying those ideals of the American Revolution.
It's a really powerful image. And then there's The Spirit of 76, or Yankee Doodle, by Archibald Willard. Those three figures marching with the flag amidst the chaos of battle. It just captures that revolutionary spirit so perfectly.
And even Rosie the Riveter, those iconic images highlighting the contributions of women during wartime. The essay points out how those paintings, now at the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas, really broaden the definition of patriotism to include and celebrate a group that had often been, well, marginalized.
Totally. It's about saying, hey, patriotism isn't just about soldiers on the battlefield. It's also about the people on the home front, the everyday people who are contributing to the war effort in all these different ways.
Right. And speaking of powerful female figures, we can't forget Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. That's such an enduring image of citizen uprising. Liberty is this strong, powerful female figure leading the charge.
It's an image that still resonates so strongly today. And what's interesting is that it's not even tied to a specific event. It's become this symbol of revolution, of people fighting for their freedom that transcends any particular time or place.
Exactly. And all these examples show how art can serve as this shorthand, this visual representation of those big, complex national narratives and ideals.
Okay, so moving on, the essay then shifts to this really intriguing idea, the power of illumination. And it's not just talking about light in the literal sense, it's about that metaphorical power of light, the way art can kind of illuminate our understanding of the world.
I love this part. Think about like those luminous landscapes and mythological scenes by J.M.W. Turner. The way he uses light and color creates this almost spiritual, otherworldly feeling. It's about beauty, yes, but also about evoking a sense of awe and wonder.
Right. And the essay mentions the American landscape painters of the 19th century, Bierstadt, Moran, Church. They captured that awe-inspiring vastness of the American West. But it was about more than just scenery. It was about symbolizing this idea of national expansion, the limitless potential of this uncharted territory.
Absolutely, they contributed to this emerging American mythology, fueling this idea of manifest destiny, of America's greatness and its boundless future.
Yeah, like think about Bierstadt's Among the Sierra Nevada, California. That painting, now at the Smithsonian, it just draws you in, makes you feel the sheer scale and majesty of the landscape.
It's about capturing that sense of wonder, the sheer grandeur of the natural world, and in doing so, reflecting back this image of the nation itself as boundless and full of potential.
So from the power of illumination, we move to this section, the power of imagery on the senses. And this one gets to the very heart of what art does, doesn't it? How artists can use their skills, their technique, to evoke emotions and completely alter our perceptions.
Yeah, this is where you really see the artist's vision and mastery at work. Take Van Gogh, for example. The essay mentions those later landscapes he painted in the south of France. And, they could have been just quiet pastoral scenes, but through his brushstrokes, that thick, almost violent application of paint, they become these expressions of his inner turmoil.
You can practically feel the intensity of his experience just by looking at the canvas, right?
Exactly. And then you have Kandinsky and his abstract paintings. They're not trying to depict the world realistically at all. Instead, it's about conveying this, visual expression of music.
It's fascinating how colors and patterns can evoke those kinds of auditory sensations.
It really is. Kandinsky was trying to tap into a more universal, almost spiritual language of feeling that went beyond representation, that spoke directly to our senses and emotions.
Then you have Edward Hopper, a very different kind of emotional landscape. His paintings, like Night Windows, evoke this really specific mood of solitude, isolation, often in urban settings. It's not loud or dramatic, but equally powerful.
Yeah, and the essay points out how Hopper's mastery of light and shadow, those really precise compositions, create this almost palpable sense of stillness and loneliness. It's like you're peering into these private moments, these lives unfolding behind closed windows.
Then you have Vlaminck with his stormy landscapes. Just looking at them can shift your mood instantly. And of course, there's Picasso, who, throughout his long career, just consistently challenged our ideas about art and form from his early blue period all the way to the revolution of Cubism and beyond.
He never stopped experimenting, never stopped pushing the boundaries of artistic expression, and in doing so, he forced us to see the world in these entirely new ways.
Finally, the essay looks at the power of beguilement and curiosity. It's about how art can engage us on this intellectual level, make us think, question, come up with our own interpretations.
A Mona Lisa, right? I mean, what is it about that painting that continues to fascinate us? The subtle smile, that mysterious background, it's like it's deliberately designed to spark endless debate and interpretation.
It's this perfect blend of technical mastery and just sheer mystery. And the essay also touches on the surrealists Dali Magritte. They take that idea of mystery and push it even further, blending reality and the subconscious in these really mind-bending ways.
Like take Magritte's The False Mirror. It's both familiar and completely strange at the same time.
Yeah.
And it makes you question your own perceptions, right?
Yeah.
What is real? What is an illusion?
Exactly. And the essay even touches on a bunch of other art movements: German Expressionism, Jewish art during WWII, Mondrian, Cezanne, the Futurists, the Fauvists, de Kooning, all pushing the boundaries of artistic expression in their own ways and engaging us in these really deep, thought-provoking dialogues.
And that's what's so fascinating about art, isn't it? It's never just one thing. It can be beautiful, powerful, disturbing, challenging, and sometimes all of those things at once.
Totally agree. And so the essay ends with this line: art and power. Words that absolutely belong together. And honestly, after going through all those examples, it's hard to argue with that.
It really is. Art has, throughout history and even today, played this incredibly powerful role in shaping our beliefs, our perceptions, and even our understanding of those who wield power in the world.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. We've been talking about this broad historical view of art's influence, but now let's get more specific, more focused. We're going to dive into how art representation and social justice intersect, and for this, we're turning to a lecture by Kimberly Crenshaw on race, gender, inequality, and intersectionality.
Crenshaw starts by grounding us in the realities of racial inequality, and then she asks this really crucial question.
Yeah.
How does the law frame these issues? She uses the example of Black Lives Matter, which, seems like such a straightforward statement, but she points out that it actually becomes this contested idea.
Which in itself is really telling, right? It reveals just how unfinished the project of achieving racial justice truly is.
Exactly. And Crenshaw frames Black Lives Matter not just as a slogan, but as this powerful discourse of resistance, directly challenging the whole notion of post-racialism that we hear so much about.
Right, like, are we truly living in a post-racial society, as some people claim? What does that even mean?
And to answer that, she takes us back to the origins of critical race theory, emphasizing how it emerged from student activism, from this need to question how knowledge itself is produced in universities.
She makes a really interesting point about how these academic spaces, they're not neutral. They're just as much sites of contestation and power dynamics as courtrooms or, hiring offices.
Absolutely. And then Crenshaw goes on to discuss what she calls the domestication of racial justice discourses, looking specifically at post-racially pragmatic approaches. She brings up Obama's efforts to address racial justice, arguing that they were often limited by this kind of performative adherence to post-racial pragmatism, this idea that you can only work within the existing system, rather than challenging the system itself.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You might be able to make some progress, but you're fundamentally limited by the shape of the hole.
Exactly. And one of the key concepts Crenshaw unpacks is the idea of colorblindness in the law. It's a really tricky and often misunderstood idea, so she does a great job of breaking down what it actually means and the assumptions it's based on.
She explains that in legal terms, colorblindness is often presented as this ideal of racial neutrality, where true equality means being blind to race. So, we shouldn't acknowledge racial differences when making decisions or creating policies.
And the underlying belief is that by ignoring racial differences, we can somehow erase inequality, rather than actually perpetuating it.
Which, a lot of people would argue is a pretty flawed premise.
Absolutely. And what's really concerning is that this idea of colorblindness has actually become the mediating principle of the 14th Amendment for a number of Supreme Court justices. That's a pretty powerful assertion, and it has huge implications for how the law approaches race and inequality.
It does. And Crenshaw points out that colorblindness also functions as a social theory of race and racism. It reduces racism to these individual acts of discrimination based on a really superficial, limited understanding of race, basically, just skin color. And this completely ignores the systemic, historical dimensions of racism and the idea that race itself is a relational concept.
So it's like, don't think about elephants, as Crenshaw puts it, but you have to know what an elephant is in order to not think about it. It's this impossible mental gymnastics.
Yeah, it creates this really strange double bind. And then she explains how this colorblind ideology is used to argue against things like affirmative action, preferential treatment, even traditional anti-discrimination measures. They're all framed as departing from this supposed neutral baseline of colorblindness and therefore seen as inherently problematic.
Anything that explicitly acknowledges race or tries to address historical inequities is suddenly labeled as preferential treatment and therefore discriminatory, which is, pretty ironic.
It is. And ultimately, colorblindness defines racial equality as this idea of symmetrical treatment, treating everyone the same regardless of their race. But as Crenshaw argues, that's not actually equality when you're starting from a place of deep historical inequality.
Right. And that brings us to her discussion of post-racialism and what she calls big eventism. This tendency to point to these big historical events like the Civil War or even Obama's election and say, see, we've moved beyond race. Those issues are in the past.
Yeah, it's like this assumption that electing a black president magically erases centuries of systemic racism.
Exactly. And Crenshaw argues that this kind of post-racial thinking is often presented as the opposite of a racial society, a complete denial of its continued existence, rather than being understood as a form or a variant of a racial society.
Just like, we understand that post-colonialism doesn't mean that the effects of colonialism have completely disappeared.
Precisely. And she emphasizes this ongoing tension between different ideologies when it comes to understanding contemporary racial inequality. She uses two really powerful contrasting quotes to highlight this divide.
The first is from Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, the part where he talks about a society in disrepair that needs fixing.
And Crenshaw makes this really important point that while we often focus on that beautiful, hopeful vision of children being judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, we tend to forget that King was also delivering this scathing indictment of the status quo, this call for urgent action to address these deep-seated injustices.
Right. And then she contrasts that with a quote from Justice Scalia in an affirmative action case where he basically says nothing is owed. This perspective essentially dismisses any claims of historical injustice, arguing that there's no need for any kind of societal repair or redistribution of resources.
So on one hand, you have this view of a society that's broken and needs fixing. And on the other, you have this insistence that we start from a clean slate, and any existing disparities are simply the result of individual choices.
And, as Crenshaw points out, this idea of colorblindness plays a huge role in justifying that latter perspective. It demands strict neutrality toward the racial status quo, making it really difficult to challenge or dismantle those existing power structures.
Which brings us to that crucial historical example, Plessy v. Ferguson.
Right, the infamous Supreme Court decision that legalized segregation in the United States. Crenshaw starts by introducing us to Homer Plessy and highlights the fact that he was only 1/8 black, which really underscores how absurd the one-drop rule was.
It's like this arbitrary social construct specifically designed to maintain racial divisions and control.
Exactly. And Plessy made two key arguments in his case. First, that the very system of hypodescent, the idea that even one drop of black blood makes a person black, was a form of racial injury. And second, that segregation based on this racial classification was a denial of equal protection under the law.
And how did the court respond to those arguments?
Well, they basically dismissed the first argument outright, saying you're legally black, so you can't argue that you're not being defined as black. This circular logic just completely avoids dealing with the inherent injustice of the entire system.
I've got about avoiding the issue.
And on the second argument, well, they infamously upheld segregation based on this completely flawed principle of symmetrical treatment, arguing that as long as black and white people were separated, they were being treated equally.
But of course, ignoring the fact that the separate facilities were almost always unequal, and that segregation itself sent this powerful message of inferiority.
Exactly. They basically said that the harms of segregation were just social, not legal, suggesting that black people should just choose to interpret it differently.
Which is ridiculous, of course. And Crenshaw points out that even Justice Harlan's famous dissent in Plessy, while it did use the term colorblind, wasn't actually based on a genuine commitment to racial equality.
His reasoning was more about white dominance and the belief that segregation was unnecessary and excessive, rather than a challenge to the racial hierarchy itself.
So even the seemingly progressive voice in Plessy wasn't actually advocating for true racial justice as we understand it today.
It's a really important nuance. And Crenshaw then draws this brilliant connection between the logic of Plessy and contemporary issues through the Richmond v. Crossan case. Richmond, which had a long history of racial discrimination, implemented this program to set aside contracts for minority-owned businesses.
But the Supreme Court struck it down, again based on this principle of symmetrical treatment and colorblindness, right?
Yep. They dismissed all the historical context, all the evidence of ongoing discrimination, and argued that the set-aside program was itself discriminatory.
And this pattern keeps repeating, doesn't it? It's like this colorblind approach intentionally ignores the real lived experiences of inequality.
Exactly. Crenshaw brings up the absurd argument that Linda Brown in Brown v. Board was supposedly harmed in the same way as white students because both were subject to racial classification. This completely ignores the inherent power imbalance and the message of subordination embedded in segregation. And she mentions Justice Roberts' idea that the way to stop discrimination is to stop thinking about race, this idea that if we just close our eyes to it, it will magically go away.
Which, of course, is not how the world works.
And then she analyzes the Bake case, which had this huge impact on affirmative action. The Supreme Court essentially rejected the idea of using affirmative action to redress past discrimination or societal inequality, and only upheld it on the grounds of diversity.
And that's been really problematic, hasn't it? He reinforces this idea that affirmative action is about giving preferences rather than addressing systemic inequities.
Exactly. It allows institutions to avoid really examining their own practices and the ways they might be perpetuating inequality. And it's fueled this whole post-racial backlash against affirmative action, framing any effort to promote racial equality as somehow discriminatory.
And we see this play out in things like the Abigail Fisher case, where just considering race as one factor among many in college admissions was seen as a personal injury. It's this huge expansion of the reverse discrimination argument.
And Crenshaw highlights how the media often portrays affirmative action in these really misleading ways. Like she mentions that Newsweek cover depicting this seemingly privileged black man, which reinforces this completely inaccurate stereotype of who actually benefits from these policies. And then there's that whole mismatch theory, which basically argues that affirmative action actually harms black students.
It's almost like we've come full circle back to those old discredited ideas about black intellectual inferiority.
It's really troubling. And Crenshaw's core argument is that this whole post-racial framework, while it seems to advocate for colorblindness, actually functions to shut down meaningful conversations about anti-racism and the connection between the past and present.
It doesn't prevent people from offering racialized explanations for inequality, but it limits our ability to actually talk about systemic racism and its ongoing impact.
Exactly. Okay, let's move on to something a little different. We're going to look at the role of art and activism in directly challenging power structures, and for this, we're focusing on the incredible story of Marsha P. Johnson and the Stonewall Rebellion.
Marsha P. Johnson was such a pivotal figure in the LGBTQ+ community, known for her amazing spirit, her defiance in the face of constant harassment, and her advocacy for trans rights.
The sources you sent really bring her story to life. We learn about her early life, her brave move to New York City, her experiences with homelessness and sex work, and how she found a sense of community in Greenwich Village.
It's interesting how she went by several names before settling on Marsha P. Johnson. And that P, it reportedly stood for Pay It No Mind.
Yeah, which is just so perfect, right? This defiant response to those who tried to put her down or question her identity. She and Sylvia Rivera co-founded Star Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which provided support and advocacy for transgender youth. It's amazing to think about the work they did, especially at a time when trans people were so often marginalized and ignored.
They really created this space of radical care and support for a community that desperately needed it.
Totally. And Johnson was also deeply involved in the gay liberation front, participating in political actions and pushing for equal rights. And her activism extended into the art. She toured with the drag theater company Hot Peaches and even had connections to Andy Warhol.
So her life really embodies this intersection of personal identity, art, and activism. She used all of those things to challenge the norms of her time and fight for LGBTQ+ rights.
Her story is a powerful reminder that the fight for social justice can take many forms, and art and performance can be incredibly effective tools for challenging the status quo.
Absolutely. Now, to help us understand these complex power dynamics, let's talk about some of the theoretical frameworks that can help us unpack these ideas.
The sources you provided lay out several key approaches: cultural studies, intersectionality, feminist theory, queer theory, and critical race theory. These are all lenses through which we can look at cultural artifacts and social practices and understand their relationship to race, gender, and class.
Like cultural studies helps us analyze how culture is produced and consumed within existing power structures. Intersectionality examines how our different social identities, race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, intersect and create these systems of oppression and privilege.
Feminist theory offers a critique of patriarchal systems and their impact on society. Queer theory challenges heteronormative assumptions and power structures. And critical race theory, as we've discussed, focuses specifically on the role of race and racism in perpetuating inequality.
These frameworks allow us to look at a huge range of things: historical events, cultural practices, even works of art like Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, or a physical space like the Stonewall Inn, and see how they reflect and contest these larger forces of social identity and power.
Exactly. They give us the tools to go beyond just describing things and to really analyze their deeper meaning and their impact on society. Speaking of Pride and Prejudice, that novel, often seen as this light romantic comedy, actually reflects some really complex social dynamics of its time.
It's set in Regency-era England, a time of huge economic anxiety and social change. And the plot, which focuses on the Bennet sisters and their quest for suitable husbands, really highlights the pressure on women to marry for financial security.
Which makes sense because back then, inheritance laws often excluded women from owning property, right?
Exactly. And one of the videos you shared provides some really interesting historical context for the novel. We're talking the rise of the middle class, this emerging consumer culture, the shift from an agrarian to an industrial economy, even the beginnings of the women's rights movement.
And it's important to remember the legal constraints on women at that time. They couldn't own property, they couldn't vote, and they were largely subject to coverture, where their legal rights were basically absorbed by their husbands upon marriage.
It's mind-boggling to think about how much has changed since then.
It really is. And, the prevailing ideology of Republican motherhood meant that women were only really allowed access to education so they could raise virtuous citizens for the new republic. And then there was the cult of domesticity, further reinforcing this idea that a woman's place was in the home.
So within that context, Elizabeth Bennet's decision to marry for love, rather than simply for financial security, is actually pretty radical. It challenges those prevailing norms and suggests that a woman's happiness and fulfillment should be a factor in these life-altering decisions.
It is. Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about representation in the media. We have this great lecture by Stuart Hall that you sent over.
Hall does a brilliant job of explaining just how complex representation is. He starts by highlighting that double meaning of the word. It's both the act of depicting something, but also the act of standing in for something else.
And then he challenges this common sense idea that representation simply reflects reality, that it's just this neutral mirror.
Right. He argues that meaning isn't just out there waiting to be reflected. It's actively constructed through the very act of representation. The meaning of an event, for example, is shaped by how it's represented through language, images, and other symbolic systems.
And he takes it a step further, saying that representation isn't just this after-the-fact activity. It actually constitutes the event itself. It shapes our understanding and even the definition of what we're talking about.
It's like the old adage, history is written by the victors. Whoever controls the narrative, whoever gets to tell this story, they have an enormous amount of power.
Totally. And Hall emphasizes the role of culture in shaping those narratives. He talks about culture as this set of shared maps of meaning that allow us to make sense of the world.
And those maps, those frameworks, we internalize them through our interactions with culture, with language. And he's using language in a really broad sense here, not just spoken or written words, but all forms of communication.
And one of the key ways we create those maps is through classification. How we categorize and group things together, how we assign meaning to them.
And Hall also addresses this concern that, well, if meaning is constructed through discourse, then does that mean there's no such thing as objective reality? He clarifies that while meaning requires representation, it doesn't mean that nothing exists outside of those systems.
Yeah, he uses that example of a ball becoming a football through the rules and context of the game.
Yeah,
The physical object exists, but its meaning is constructed through our shared understanding of how that game works.
exactly. And then he introduces this concept of signifying practices, which is basically all the symbolic work involved in producing meaning within a given culture. He highlights the immense power of the media in circulating those meanings, shaping public opinion, and influencing our understanding of the world.
But he's also careful to acknowledge that interpersonal communication still matters, those face-to-face interactions where we share ideas and stories.
Right, it's not just about the mass media. We're constantly negotiating meaning in our everyday lives, in our conversations with each other.
And one of Hall's key points is that power is inseparable from representation. He asks, who has the power to decide which meanings get circulated, whose voices get heard, and whose stories get told?
And to illustrate this, he uses that really striking image of Linford Christie, the black British athlete, draped in the Union Jack after winning at the Olympics.
Yeah, it's such a powerful image because it challenges our assumptions about British national identity.
Exactly. He's making a statement about who belongs, who gets to be seen as British, even if they don't fit the traditional mold. And Hall goes on to talk about how viewers are never passive recipients of meaning. We're all actively involved in constructing meaning through our own engagement with images and narratives, to the active identification through our own personal experiences and cultural backgrounds.
Meaning isn't just something fixed and inherent in the image itself. It's created in that dynamic interaction between the representation and the viewer.
Exactly. And Hall also talks about how attempts to fix meaning, to control the narrative, are always tied to issues of power and ideology,
Yeah.
like stereotyping, for example.
Right. Stereotypes try to reduce entire groups of people to these narrow sets of characteristics, often negative ones. And those stereotypes are incredibly powerful because they shape how we perceive and interact with each other.
And he argues that the way to challenge stereotypes isn't just to reverse them, to create these opposing, equally simplistic images.
It's about disrupting that whole system of fixed meaning, opening up those categories to allow for greater complexity and nuance.
Exactly. Keeping representation fluid, open to change, is essential for creating a more just and equitable society.
Okay, so for our final source, we're turning to this really interesting discussion from the Aspen Institute on the relationship between art and power. And here, we're shifting our focus to the local level, to the role of art in our communities.
They use the city of Seattle as an example of a place that's really integrated the arts into its civic life, and they argue that this has contributed to its overall success and innovation.
And they use this beautiful metaphor of the gardens of democracy, where art is not some kind of frivolous add-on, but an essential part of a healthy, thriving society.
It makes you think, what role does art play in your own community?
It really does. And the discussion also brings us back to this central idea that art is about power. They point out how artistic expression has been at the heart of so many social movements, the Arab Spring, Tiananmen Square, Occupy Wall Street.
And it's no coincidence that totalitarian regimes always try to control artistic expression. They understand how powerful art can be in shaping thought and mobilizing people.
Totally. And the Aspen Institute argues that in a world where opportunity is increasingly concentrated, where a small number of people are making decisions that affect everyone, it's more important than ever to cultivate the kinds of skills that engagement with the arts fosters: creativity, critical thinking, communication.